Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving deep into something we've been getting a ton of questions about. China's role in Africa.
Yeah.
We've seen headlines, we've seen concerns about safety, about countries getting trapped in debt, and about, what China's real motives are. So we're going to unpack all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got a bunch of sources of reports, analysis, firsthand accounts, and let's just get right into it.
Let's do it.
So right off the bat, we've seen this massive increase in Chinese investment, right? Especially in infrastructure in Africa over the last couple of decades. Like, what, over $340 billion?
Yeah, it's massive. Mostly going into ports, railways, power plants, that kind of thing. I think that's where a lot of those questions come from, right? Like, is this genuine development, or is there something, something else going on?
Right, exactly. And it makes you think, well, hold on. How does this impact safety and stability in these countries?
Yeah.
Could this lead to, unsustainable debt? And I know one term that keeps popping up is debt trap diplomacy.
Right. Debt trap diplomacy. So the idea there is that China's intentionally giving out loans that these countries can't possibly repay.
Right.
And then they use that leverage to, take control of important assets or resources. But honestly, it's way more complicated than that.
Okay, so it's not as clear-cut as it might seem at first.
No, not at all.
Okay.
There are definitely valid concerns about transparency, like how these deals are made,
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is most African countries actually owe more to private lenders than they do to China.
Oh, interesting. So that whole narrative about, China holding all the cards, maybe that's not the whole picture.
Right. It's like with that thing about the Entebbe International Airport in Uganda.
Yeah, I remember that.
A lot of early media reports were saying that China was going to take it over because of unpaid debts.
Right.
But when you actually look into it, there was never any real risk of that happening. It just wasn't true.
So it's a good reminder to not always believe the hype. And look, I think a lot of folks are wondering how this whole approach from China, how does it compare to, say, traditional Western aid?
Right. Well, they're pretty different, actually. Like the West, they usually focus on aid and good governance, and they often attach conditions to that assistance, like pushing for political or economic reforms.
Okay.
China, on the other hand, they're more about infrastructure and trade, less about interfering with internal politics.
So kind of like that saying, right, where I think it was an African minister who said, when China comes to my country, I get a bridge. When America comes to my country, I get a lecture.
Yeah, I've heard that. And it kind of sums it up, right? Obviously it's a bit of a simplification, but
sure.
But there's a sense that China's approach is seen as more practical, less meddling.
Yeah.
But, of course, there are criticisms on both sides.
Of course.
People point to a lack of transparency with some of China's projects, concerns about the environment, and, whether these projects actually benefit local communities enough. And on the Western side, you hear about aid being ineffective or even harmful in some cases, and about how it doesn't really address the underlying causes of poverty.
It seems like every approach has its own baggage.
Yeah, pretty much.
And this leads us to another big question, and that's the whole human rights issue. Is China, turning a blind eye to these issues in the name of, getting these economic deals?
It's a huge concern.
Yeah.
And it's true. China generally doesn't criticize the human rights records of African countries. They're all about economic cooperation, and that's their focus. And this is totally different from the West, where they often tie aid and trade to improvements in human rights.
So does that mean China is, actively enabling authoritarian regimes?
Yeah.
What do African leaders think about this?
Well, a lot of African leaders actually appreciate China's non-interference policy. They see Western pressure on human rights as almost a form of neocolonialism.
Okay.
Like they're trying to control their affairs, impose their values.
It raises this whole concept of neocolonialism, which is basically saying that, even today, powerful countries are still trying to control less powerful ones, maybe not directly, but through economics or politics. And there are definitely strong arguments on both sides of this.
Yeah, it's complicated.
So who gets to decide what's best for these nations? And how do you balance the need for, economic development with protecting fundamental human rights?
Yeah.
Those are tough questions.
For sure.
And I know a big concern for a lot of people is the impact on jobs. Are these Chinese projects actually benefiting African workers?
Yeah, there's this idea out there that Chinese companies just bring in their own people and leave the locals without opportunities.
Right.
But some research actually paints a different picture. There was one study that found that something like 95% of employees in Chinese-owned manufacturing firms in Africa were African.
Wow, 95%. That's surprising, given what we often hear.
It is, but also shows how important it is to look beyond the headlines and really dig into the data.
Right, because it's not just about how many jobs there are.
Exactly. It's about what kinds of jobs they are, what the wages are like, what the working conditions are. You gotta look at the long-term impact on the community.
It's about quality and sustainability, not just quantity.
Precisely. And a good example of this whole complexity is what's been happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC.
The DRC, yeah, a country rich in resources. They made a huge deal with China back in 2008, right?
Yeah, a big one. So Chinese companies, they put in $3 billion to develop infrastructure.
Okay.
And in exchange, they got access to a massive copper and cobalt mine worth like $3.2 billion. The idea was that the profits from the mine, which would be tax-free, would pay back both investments. But this whole thing, it sparked a lot of controversy.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
Later on, leaked documents suggested that millions of dollars from that mine actually ended up in the pockets of people connected to the then president, Joseph Kabila.
Oh.
So, big concerns about corruption, lack of transparency, and whether the DRC was really getting a fair deal for its resources.
That sounds like a textbook example of what people worry about with that debt trap diplomacy idea.
Yeah, exactly. It shows how important it is to really scrutinize these agreements, make sure things are transparent, and that both sides are held accountable.
Absolutely. So we've seen the worries about debt traps, about potential exploitation, even whispers of neocolonialism. But at the same time, there's also the view that China's approach can be less intrusive, more practical than what we see from the West. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is.
Definitely not black and white.
No. And to really get a handle on all of this, we got to zoom out a bit.
Okay.
Look at the bigger geopolitical picture. What's China's growing influence in Africa doing on the world stage?
Right, because it's not just about China and Africa. It's about how this is shifting the balance of power globally.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be digging into after the break.
Stay tuned.
So yeah, China's presence in Africa, it's definitely shaking things up globally. It's challenging that, traditional Western dominance we've seen on the continent.
In the U.S. and the EU, they're not just sitting back and watching. They've launched their own initiatives, right? Like the EU's Global Gateway and the U.S.'s Build Back Better World.
Yeah, B3W, right. But, there's a fair bit of skepticism around these programs.
Okay, how's that?
Some experts, they think these initiatives are more about countering China than genuinely helping African nations.
It's more about competition than cooperation.
Exactly. And there's this worry that they might not have the resources or the long-term commitment to really make a difference.
So it's like Africa has become this battleground in a new kind of Cold War.
Yeah.
Are African nations just pawns in this game?
Not necessarily. I mean, they have their own goals, their own priorities, and they're getting pretty good at playing this game, leveraging these relationships to their advantage.
So they're not just passively accepting whatever's offered. They're actively shaping these partnerships.
Exactly. They're looking for deals that bring real benefits and respect their sovereignty. It's not just China calling the shots.
It's more of a multiplayer game then.
Definitely. And it's way more dynamic than that simple, China versus the West narrative.
Right. It's about African nations diversifying their partnerships, not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And it brings us back to that idea we talked about earlier, partnership versus patronage. Is there a risk that, whether it's China or the West, these relationships could become a new kind of dependency?
Yeah, that's a good point. A true partnership, it should be based on mutual respect, shared benefits, right?
Absolutely. It shouldn't be about one side dictating terms or just extracting resources without, contributing to sustainable development.
It's got to be a win-win. And speaking of sustainability, are these Chinese infrastructure projects actually sustainable in the long run? I mean, what happens when those loans come due?
That's the key question. We need to look beyond those shiny new ports and railways and ask, who's really benefiting. Are they creating jobs for local communities? Are they environmentally sound? Are they built to last and, actually make economic sense over time?
So infrastructure is important, but it's got to be done responsibly. It can't just be about short-term gains for investors.
Right. It's got to be about long-term benefits for African nations. And this ties back into that whole debt issue.
Okay.
We've talked about that debt trap diplomacy narrative, but it's important to remember that not all Chinese loans are the same.
Yeah, there's got to be different types, right?
Exactly. Some are concessional loans, so those have low interest rates, long repayment periods. Others are more like commercial loans, with market rates.
So it's not as straightforward as saying China's lending money, therefore it's a trap.
No, not at all. You got to look at the terms of each deal, the type of loan, all of that.
Transparency is key. African nations need to be fully informed, understand the risks, and be able to negotiate deals that are in their best interests.
And that's where capacity building comes in.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
African governments, they need the expertise to really evaluate these complex financial agreements, understand those long-term implications, and make sure these projects align with their development goals.
So empowering African nations to make informed decisions, negotiate from a position of strength, not desperation.
Exactly. They need to be able to say no to bad deals and demand better terms when necessary.
That makes sense. And something else to remember, it's easy to think of China as this monolithic entity.
Right.
But they're not. I mean, you have different companies, institutions all involved in these projects.
Exactly. You've got companies, banks, government agencies, all with, potentially different motivations, different approaches.
So it's not just about China. It's about understanding the specific actors involved in each deal.
Absolutely. Some might be more transparent than others. Some might have stronger ethical commitments. African nations need to be aware of those nuances, do their homework, and choose partners carefully.
Find those partners who are in it for the long haul, truly invested in Africa's success.
Exactly. And beyond those economic and political dimensions, we can't forget the human side of things.
Right, the impact on people's everyday lives, their cultures, their communities.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the big picture of trade and investment, but it's ultimately about people.
About individual stories, connections, cultural exchanges happening on the ground.
And those interactions, they're not always easy. There can be misunderstandings, cultural clashes, even exploitation. We got to be honest about those challenges.
But also recognize that potential for mutual learning, for building bridges between communities.
Exactly. True partnership, it requires empathy, respect, a willingness to learn from each other.
And this might be a question a lot of listeners have. What does all this mean for me?
Yeah.
How can I, as an individual, make sense of this complex situation? How can I engage with it in a way that matters?
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by, the scale of it all, but everyone can play a role in building a more just and equitable world. Start by educating yourself about these issues. Seek out different perspectives, challenge your own assumptions.
Support organizations working to promote sustainable development, human rights, cross-cultural understanding.
Have those tough conversations with your friends, family, community. The choices we make today, individually and collectively, they shape the world of tomorrow.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, looking at the economic, political, human dimensions of China's involvement in Africa.
We've seen how incredibly complex this relationship is. The opportunities, the challenges, the risks, the rewards.
No easy answers. But one thing's for sure, Africa's a continent on the rise, and its relationship with China is playing a big role in shaping its future.
And moving forward, it's crucial to approach this relationship with nuance, understanding, a commitment to building a better world for everyone.
Now, let's wrap things up with some final thoughts, some key takeaways in this last part of our deep dive. All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into China and Africa. We've really gone deep, haven't we? From those concerns about debt traps to the whole neocolonialism debate to, what this means for people on the ground. As we wrap up, what are your biggest takeaways from all this?
I think for me, it's how different the experiences are. You can't just lump everything together. What's happening in one African country might be totally different from what's going on in another.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Exactly. Every African nation's unique. Each partnership has its own story. And there's a whole range of approaches and, outcomes.
So we got to be careful about making sweeping judgments.
Yeah, we really do. We need to go beyond the headlines, beyond those easy narratives, and really look at the specifics of each situation.
Like with that debt trap thing, you can't just assume every loan is a trap.
Right. You got to look at the terms, the motivations behind it, what it means for the country in the long run. And you also got to consider the bigger picture, the political and economic situation in that specific country.
Because those things influence how decisions are made.
Exactly. And all of that highlights the agency of African nations. They're not just passive recipients, they're negotiating, they're shaping these relationships to benefit themselves.
Which brings us back to that question we started with. Is Africa safe? How does all of this impact stability and security?
Tough question. I mean, on the one hand, infrastructure development can be a good thing, right?
Sure.
It can boost the economy, create jobs, improve living standards, and all of that contributes to stability.
Yeah, better infrastructure can connect communities, make trade easier, improve access to things like healthcare and education. That's all got to help, right?
Exactly. But there are also risks. If these projects aren't managed well, if the debt becomes too much to handle, if people feel like they're being exploited, well, that can lead to instability, even conflict.
So it's like a double-edged sword. China's investment could help with safety and stability, but only if it's done right. It has to be responsible, transparent, and actually benefit the people living there.
Exactly. And let's not forget about other factors, too.
Like what?
Things like political instability, corruption, climate change, those things can impact safety, regardless of whether China's involved or not.
Right, it's complicated.
It really is. And at the end of the day, whether Africa's safe or not depends on a whole bunch of things, not just China.
And the other big question, the one we hear a lot, is China really there to partner? Or is there some hidden agenda? What are their true intentions?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And honestly, we've seen evidence that supports both sides.
Okay, how so?
Well, you look at China's focus on infrastructure, on trade, their willingness to work with governments without demanding political changes, their whole win-win approach that could point to a genuine desire to partner up.
Right. And you can't deny that a lot of African nations have seen real benefits from this relationship.
Definitely. Better transportation, more access to electricity, those are tangible things. But then there's also the flip side. The lack of transparency in some deals, the worry about debt, the potential environmental impact, the stories of workers being exploited. That stuff makes you wonder if it's really about development or more about extracting resources and gaining influence.
So it's that lack of clarity, the not knowing for sure what China's up to, that's what fuels the skepticism.
Exactly. It's a case of actions speak louder than words. Until there's more transparency, more accountability, that debate's going to keep going.
So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to make of all of this?
Well, as we wrap this up, I think there are a few key things to remember. First, there's no one China-Africa story. Every relationship's different with its own opportunities and challenges.
Don't oversimplify it.
Exactly. Second, go deeper than the headlines, look for the evidence, listen to different perspectives, and form your own opinions.
Don't just accept what you're told.
Right. Third, remember that African nations have a say in all of this. They're active players, shaping these relationships to fit their own needs.
They're not just going along for the ride.
Exactly. And fourth, remember that both China and the West have a role to play in Africa's development. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
There's room for everyone.
Right. And finally, and maybe most importantly, remember that this is ultimately about people, their lives, their hopes, their dreams for the future. Let's engage with this whole thing thoughtfully, critically, and with the goal of creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Well said. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us, everyone. We hope it's given you some food for thought and encouraged you to keep learning about this fascinating and always evolving relationship between China and Africa.